welcome to Global Ecofeminist, a podcast where we discuss topics related to the intersection between the environment and feminism. Feminism supports the rights of men, women, and non-gender conforming people, and all are welcome on this platform. Thank you so much for being here today, and let's get into today's topic. Today we are going to discuss the intersection between ecofeminism and Native and Indigenous people around the world. Specifically, today I'm going to be talking about Native people in the Americas. First off, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. Today, and for the past about 20 years, I've been residing on Ohlone land in the Bay Area. I would just like to acknowledge that Ohlone people have been stewards of this land long before I or my ancestors have gotten to this land. And I respect and honor and appreciate Ohlone people for stewarding this land and still stewarding to this day. Thank you. Today I am wearing some earrings from an Indigenous artist. She made these earrings and they're absolutely gorgeous. I love her work. It is very important to support local Native artists however we can, by donation, buying locally, or any other output like that. At the end of today's podcast, I will be putting out some resources that you can donate to, some books you could be interested in reading about this topic, and yes, so that will be at the end of this podcast, so stay tuned. To get into today's topic, I'm going to start talking about how environmental racism is a serious problem related to ecofeminism. And a group that is largely disproportionately affected by this problem are Native communities. Specifically today, I will be talking about Native communities in the United States and some parts of the Americas. Native communities are disproportionately affected by the result of climate change. Many Native communities are placed on purpose next to large company industrial plants that emit toxic air and pollute water. Some background on this is when colonizers got to Turtle Island, which is now referred to as the United States by many Western languages, they forcibly removed Native people from their homelands to create way for industrial innovation and opportunity for profit. So Native people were already living here on this land, and colonists came and forced them out of their homeland onto what today we call reservations, and that is where many of the industrial plants are held. Colonizers forced Native people from their homelands onto these reservations because they knew that putting coal plants would not get enough backlash for them to stop what they were doing, because a lot of the time corporations put industrial plants by communities that do not have a lot of resources historically to fight back, and a lot of the time that resource is money. So historically, Native people have been displaced from their homelands, had their resources taken away from them on purpose for profit and opportunity for innovation by colonists. With that being said, it is important that we recognize that Native people are the original stewards of this land and know how to care for it properly. Native people have been stewards of this land for thousands and thousands of years, and it is important that we recognize and acknowledge and respect the knowledge that Native and Indigenous people can give to the land. When European settlers arrived to this land, Native people knew that what was being done to the land was very harmful, and that is still very applicable to this day. There is a great book that I've been reading recently titled Regeneration, Ending the Climate Crisis in One Generation, written by Hawken. And he wrote a chapter about indigeneity in the world, and I'd like to share a few quotes with you from him. He explains how, quote, "The vast majority of indigenous nations did not, and still do not, see the land as a belonging, but saw themselves as belonging to the land. This difference in understanding, an individual who is separate from the land versus a biological community dwelling within the land, was the excuse used by colonists to steal 1.5 billion acres from indigenous peoples on Turtle Island. These are known as the stolen lands," end quote. Hawken continues to explain how, quote, "Indigenous people thrived on land and sea for thousands of years because of intimate knowledge of weather, botany, animals, migrations, medicines, forests, food, and the oceans. They practice observational science, discoveries around the natural world gleaned over millennia, etched into metaphor and conveyed through stories passed down in unbroken oral traditions," end quote. This knowledge about the land and its resources for sustaining life for millennia was curated carefully by indigenous and native peoples around the world before colonists arrived. Colonists did not foster the same care or understanding or patience into learning the land, and we see that as a result of these actions in environmental racism and in turn resource depletion. I'd like to speak a little bit about Kim Tallbear, a Sisseton Wapoan Ioti professor at the University of Alberta, specializing in racial politics and science. I've read many of her works in my research and university classes, and I just have to say she is incredible. I love her writing. She is wonderful the way she speaks. I've watched a few of her talks, and she is just an amazing person and very, very, very smart, and I'd love to share some words with you that she has spoken today. She states, quote, "An environmental human divide is a narrative that is absent from the indigenous narrative. Indigenous articulations of indigeneity challenge colonial conceptions that bind indigeneity to cultural stasis and economic deprivation. Such articulations can limit efforts by indigenous peoples to build their autonomy and control resources in order to resist the assimilationist state," end quote. Here, Tallbear is referring to sovereignty that indigenous people and native people have not received once the colonists arrived. They were promised sovereignty and autonomy over their lands and cultural practices. This was broken by the colonists. They broke their treaties. It is important to recognize that indigeneity is defined by indigenous people themselves. And through my research today, I recognize that I do not live in a native body, an indigenous body. I have not experienced the discrimination, the trauma, the pain that indigenous people have suffered. And I would like to honor and respect that fact. Today, I am relaying information that I have researched in hopes to bring education to those who may not know this information and help everyone have a better understanding of the history and the implications that are a result of colonists' behavior today. Colonists arrived on Turtle Island with a new narrative of control and conquest. They took sovereignty from the native communities already taking care of and stewarding the land. This narrative allowed environmental racism to spread through the land and both metaphorically and literally poison native communities. Environmental racism against native communities can be seen in recent cases of the Flint, Michigan water crisis and the Dakota Access Pipeline, DAPL. They target native communities for land use and are outwardly classist. Native communities were pushed off their homelands and were not given respect or status once colonists arrived. They were forced to small areas, which are now referred to as reservations, where they would have to assimilate to the majority's culture to merely survive. We'll go a little bit more into this in the next few minutes. Survival was based on how American they could become and how much money they could make. Although the less money a community has, the more likely they are to be exposed to harmful toxins from company plants because they are susceptible of losing the dispute without large monetary means. We spoke a little bit about this earlier. When a community doesn't have that much money, it's harder to fight the big corporations that are coming into the communities and making toxins and making pollution for those disadvantaged communities already. That is a reason why a lot of companies put their plants on that land, because they know that under the rules of colonists, if you don't have money, you cannot fight back. And if you don't have status, you cannot fight back. And those are in the eyes of colonists. And that is the reality that we are living in, have been living in, and need to recognize that this needs to change. So now I'd like to start speaking about Native women specifically in relation to ecofeminism and environmental racism. Native women are exceptionally targeted by environmental racism. This includes being forcibly sterilized, making the largest rape, kidnapping, and murder cases by race, and past treatment in Indian boarding schools. Native women and girls face increased violence from the intersection of environmental racism and patriarchal rule. Colonists' patriarchal rule that they brought overseas with them acknowledge masculine traits to be more valuable in society. Chown Mallory states, quote, "Environmental justice stands to gain from incorporation of ecofeminist analysis of the material and conceptual intersections between the oppression of women, people of color, Indigenous peoples, the poor, and other marginalized human groups, and the degradation of natural places." End quote. Environmental justice cannot be discussed without acknowledging the intersection that ecofeminism has on the destruction of the natural world. Through this analysis that Mallory acknowledges, it is important that ecofeminism is a way that we look at how environmental degradation on Indigenous and Native communities has come to be within colonization and the result of colonization. Now I'm going to speak a bit about Indian boarding schools. This can be very triggering and traumatic, so I just like to state that I will be talking a bit in depth about Indian boarding schools. So if you need a moment, if you don't feel like this is okay for you at this time, please feel free to sign off, and thank you so much for being here. I know it's a very heavy topic, and I acknowledge that. I feel it is important to face history and what happened in the United States, the Americas, and Turtle Island. So Indian boarding schools began under Richard Henry Pratt in 1875, where he took a military institution outline and applied it to the development of these schools. He established the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which remained open from 1879 to 1918. An estimated 100,000 Native children were forced to attend these schools, especially after attendance laws were enacted in 1891. These children were placed in these schools to have their culture essentially taken from them. Once it was no longer socially acceptable to try to genocide and mass extinct Indigenous peoples and Native peoples in the United States, these schools were made so that Native children were not able to pass down or even practice their cultures, traditions, or languages. It was extremely awful, and the Merriam Report of 1928 analyzed horrific acts that happened in various Indian boarding schools. This included poor nutrition, overcrowding, lack of medical care, student labor, and low curriculum standards. Many children attempted to run away back to their homes because who wouldn't want to? No one wants to be there. But when they were caught, they were severely punished. They were beaten, humiliated in front of their classmates, or even had shock treatments used on them. In an article titled "Stolen Lives, the Indigenous Peoples of Canada and the Indian Residential Schools, the Residential School Experience from Facing History and Ourselves," the article states, quote, Lorna, who was at the Mohawk Institute from 1940 to 1945, describes the shock treatments the girls would receive. They used to give us shock treatments for bedwetting. A lot of us never wet our beds, but we still had to do it anyway. They said it worked for the girls, but didn't work for the boys. They couldn't really ever find out why, but I think it was because of the sexual abuse that went on there. They used to bring in a battery, a motor of some sort, or some kind of gadget, and he'd put it on the girl's hand, and it would jerk us around, and it would go all the way through us from end to end. It would travel, and we would do that about 3 times. End quote. Young girls in these institutions experienced sexual abuse, physical abuse, verbal abuse, and would sometimes even have their hair shaved off because the teachers knew that hair was symbolically important to their culture. Many Native people only cut their hair when they are mourning or in grief. These institutions wanted to strip Native children of their natural culture, traditions, and languages, and knowledge. Hawken writes a bit about this in his indigeneity section of his book, where he states, quote, Indigenous people persisted in the face of determined efforts to erase it. Colonization instigated centuries of rape, violence, genocide, and dispossession. At certain times and places when violence was not considered acceptable, colonists tried to strip away Indigenous cultures instead. Children were taken from their parents, forcibly moved to distant boarding schools, put in uniforms, forbidden to speak their native language, controlled like cadets at a boot camp, and taught a way of thinking that demeaned their culture and history. On top of their effort to obliterate their culture, they were subject to physical and sexual abuse by the boarding schools. End quote. These horrific practices we have seen in history and in the past are ongoing to this day and have been used as a violence tactic against Native women and girls for centuries. Native women and girls are also subject to forced sterilization in their communities. Environmental justice relates to both ecofeminism and reproductive justice. In many Native communities, the woman is seen as the head of the household, for she creates sacred life. Many Native tribes are considered matriarchal, compared to the patriarchal model that we have seen colonists bring to the Americas and around the world. Children are the bloodline to the next lineage and are deeply valued. We don't really see this model in patriarchal views and values. We can see the difference between patriarchal model and matriarchal model and how they differ, and how one is obviously very overbearing and dangerous and violent. Colonists knew that Native children are the bloodline to the next generation of Native and Indigenous people. So they took a practice called forced sterilization and put this onto the bodies of Native women and girls. Forced sterilization establishes direct violence to Native women and girls' bodies and is driven by the desire to eliminate Indigenous peoples around the world. Colonists used this awful practice because they knew that they did not want Native people to continue their bloodline and lineage when they arrived. They wanted to make way for innovation and profit, and they wanted to do everything they could to make sure that nothing or no one got in the way of that. There's a great film that I watched in my Native American Studies class titled Ama, meaning mother, where we meet a woman named Jean Whitehorse, who is a Navajo woman. She describes her experience being forcefully sterilized without her consent by a doctor. Native women are often sterilized without their consent and without even knowing sometimes. She, for example, was sterilized during her C-section when she was giving birth to her child. A doctor went in and sterilized her, and she was unaware and unwilling. She also accounts for recalling doctors taunting Native girls and women to become sterilized. This is a direct correlation with patriarchal dominance for control of women's bodies and, in turn, the natural world. This is how we can see ecofeminism intersecting with Native women's bodies, Native communities, and Native culture, and how it all intersects and is very dangerous, violent, and aggressive, and just horrible. I think it's really important to acknowledge that and acknowledge our history, where we are today, and what we can do to better that situation for others. And I'm going to go into that more towards the end of this podcast. So this intentional practice of forced sterilization led to depression, alcoholism, and violence in many Native communities. When the patriarchal views and values of colonizers was brought to Turtle Island and the Americas, they stressed that in order to be successful and have status and have power, you had to be aggressive and violent and control the earth. And in turn, Native men and colonizers started to manipulate and control Native women's bodies in turn. It wasn't always like this, and it is definitely a value that colonizers brought to Native communities. Such violence includes missing and murdered Indigenous women in many Native communities throughout Canada and the United States. Unfortunately, we see a lot of murders, kidnappings, and violence upon Native women's bodies. In fact, it is the highest statistical rate of rape, kidnapping, and murdering in this country. A lot of the time, Native women aren't acknowledged or even cared about by media or any outlet that might acknowledge that they are suffering and in so much pain. In an article titled "The Murders of Indigenous Women in Canada as Feminicides Towards a Decolonial Intersectional Reconceptualization of Femicide," author Paulina Garcia del Moral states, quote, "The murders of Indigenous women in Canada constitute racialized gendered violence rooted in the ongoing material and discursive effects of colonial power relations." End quote. The violence used on Native women and girls is rooted in colonization and the desire to conquer land and in turn conquer their bodies. This is an example of how looking at the patriarchal system we are living in can be seen through an ecofeminist lens, and how that can be helpful to analyze these issues that are going on. We see that blatant connection between how the earth is being treated and how Native women and all women's bodies are being treated. Garcia goes on to state, quote, racialized gendered discourses of femininity that have historically associated Indigenous women's sexuality with immorality have marked them disposable. This marking is intimately tied to dispossession, enabling Indigenous populations to be considered as primitive and barbaric and unfit owners of the land. End quote. So colonizers took this rhetoric from the patriarchal system and values and turned it to make it seem that Native peoples are not fit to steward the land. Although Native people have been stewarding this land, and very well, I might add, for thousands and thousands of years. So this rhetoric was really a fear control tactic that colonists used to oppress Native communities to this day, and especially Native women and girls. Garcia continues to state, quote, it simultaneously produces a cultural narrative that places the killing of Indigenous people and women in the context of prostitution, thereby dissociating this violence from the ongoing harmful material effects of colonialism, like the extreme poverty that may lead these women to engage in sex work in the first place. An analyst named Razak illustrates that Canadian courts consistently reproduce this cultural representation, rendering invisible the dehumanization of Indigenous women, its relation to the construction of the modern Canadian settler state, and the contemporary subjectivities of colonizers who understand themselves as entitled to the land and to the bodies of Indigenous women. End quote. I think that last line that Garcia stated sums it up pretty well in terms of what lens we are analyzing ecofeminism and patriarchal views and Native communities from today. I'll say it again. So, colonizers who understand themselves as entitled to the land and to the bodies of Indigenous women. In that statement, Garcia understands that through the lens of ecofeminism, colonists see the land, the environment, as a conquest, as something to take and to own and conquer. And they also see that in Native women's bodies. And that is the intersection of ecofeminism and Native communities as it relates to women. So I know that was a lot to unpack, and I really appreciate those of you who are still here and are still being strong and brave, speaking and hearing about this specific topic. This history is very painful for Native communities, and I believe it is painful for those who are a result of colonization to look at and acknowledge. And through this podcast, I would like to have that as my main goal, as recognizing the harm and the damage and the trauma that has come out from this conquest. That being said, Native women around the world are targeted by the result of the patriarchy and deserve justice. Right now, I would love to give you some resources that you can donate to, those being the Native American Rights Fund and the Warrior Woman Project. The Native American Rights Fund supports Native American rights protection, resource and lifeways protection, and tribal sovereignty. It is important that tribal sovereignty is acknowledged and given. The Warrior Women Project provides a forum for Indigenous activists and artists to tell their stories for the benefit of future generations. So those are just some resources that you can feel free to check out, look more into, learn more about, donate to. Those are there for you. Also, at the beginning of this podcast, I recognized my position on Native land, and I got that information through a website titled native-land.ca. So when you go to that website, you can see exactly what land you are on, who are the stewards, the original stewards, and how you can research more to help your local Native communities that could have a website or somewhere to support their efforts as well. I would also love to recommend some books that relate to this topic. So one book that I actually quoted from and mentioned today is Regeneration, Ending the Climate Crisis in One Generation. So this is by Paul Hawken. It is just a year or two old now, and it is very good. It is a great book. It has so much information, and again, there is a section about indigeneity specifically, and many other topics relating to that in this book. So that is a wonderful book. Highly recommend you check it out. Another book that I would recommend is There by Tommy Orange. I actually found out about this book and read it in my Native American Studies class in college, and it is the stories of Tommy Orange, who tells his story about his experience in the Bay Area, specifically Oakland, and he talks about being in an urban setting as a Native American man. So this is another great story and book I highly recommend that you check out at some point. So that is There by Tommy Orange. Finally, a book that I'm currently reading that I've heard so much about and love so far is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and she writes about, like here it says, indigenous wisdom, scientific knowledge, and the teachings of plants. So she goes into a lot of medicine related content, how it relates to indigeneity, and how this knowledge can really help us progress forward into a better world and a more sustainable world. So, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, a great book. Those are some resources that I highly recommend you check out if you have a moment of time. It is important to recognize and acknowledge Native communities and Indigenous communities in the United States, Turtle Island, in the Americas, all around the world. There's so much to learn, and I feel very grateful to share this knowledge with you today, and I hope it is received with you today, and I hope that there's something you learned that you can take away and use it for a construction of a better world. I will be putting the resources to these books, to these websites, down below in the description, so you can find everything you need there. You can also visit my website. I will also link that below, and my Instagram account. Give me a follow if you'd like. I would love to chat with you all, hear your ideas, and if anyone is interested in coming on a podcast episode, please do not hesitate to ask. You can email me at globalecofeminist@gmail.com. Thank you so much for being here today, for taking the time to listen, and for being respectful and bringing light and love into this world. I appreciate you all, and I will see you in the next episode.